every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. November is a ghost in San Francisco. It arrives not with the fiery colors of autumn, but with a cool, silver dampness that clings to the city's hills. The fog, a constant summer companion, recedes, leaving behind a crystalline, almost brittle light. It's a month of clarity and shadows, and on the morning of November 27, 1978, the light falling on the Grand Beaux-Arts dome of City Hall was particularly sharp. Inside its marbled halls, the business of the city was humming along. Typewriters clattered. Phones rang. The air smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, ever-present scent of ambition. It was a place of power, but it was also a place of people. Secretaries gossiped over coffee. Aides rushed through corridors with files tucked under their arms. And politicians debated the soul of a city that was, at that moment, one of the most turbulent and exciting places in America. San Francisco in 1978 was a crucible. It was a city tearing itself apart and rebuilding itself in a new image, a battleground for the future of American culture. It was a magnet for the hopeful and the dispossessed, a place where the old guard of working-class, God-fearing families looked on with suspicion as new tribes staked their claim. At the heart of this transformation was the Castro district, which had blossomed from a quiet Irish neighborhood into the vibrant, unapologetic epicenter of gay life. And at the heart of the Castro was Harvey Milk, a supervisor, yes, but more than that, a symbol. His election a year earlier had been a political earthquake, a declaration that the city's gay community would no longer be invisible, no longer be silent. He was their voice, their hope, their proof that they belonged. In the mayor's office on the second floor, George Moscone presided over this beautiful, chaotic city. He was a liberal lion, a man who saw San Francisco's progressive energy not as a threat, but as its greatest strength. He was an ally to Milk, a champion of the city's diverse communities, a builder of coalitions. Together, they represented the new San Francisco. But this new San Francisco had enemies. It had those who felt left behind, who saw the city of their birth becoming a foreign land. They saw their values mocked, their traditions eroded, their political power slipping away, and their champion, their man on the board of supervisors, was a former cop, a former firefighter, a clean-cut all-American boy named Dan White. On that clear November morning, Dan White was no longer a supervisor. He had resigned, then changed his mind, and was now a man adrift. He walked toward City Hall not with a briefcase, but with a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver tucked into his waistband. He carried 10 extra rounds of ammunition in his coat pocket, hollow-point bullets, designed not just to wound, but to expand on impact, to tear and to destroy. He wouldn't enter through the grand public entrance with its tall columns and metal detectors. He would slip like a ghost through a basement window he knew was often left unlocked. He was on a singular, terrible mission. Within the hour, the clatter of typewriters would be replaced by the shriek of sirens. The corridors would fill not with aides, but with panicked police officers. And a blood-soaked political colleague would step before the cameras and announce to a horrified world that both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk had been shot and killed. The assassinations were an act of unspeakable political violence that ripped the soul out of San Francisco. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the most infamous part of this tragedy was yet to come. It would unfold in a courtroom, where a team of defense lawyers would craft a narrative so audacious, so bizarre, that it would become a permanent and profoundly misunderstood part of American legal folklore. It was a defense that would be reduced to a single absurd snack cake. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we are not merely recounting a political assassination. We are dissecting the anatomy of a legal defense, a strategy of diminished capacity that was so cynically effective and so brilliantly mischaracterized that it became known to the world as the Twinkie Defense. To understand the explosion of violence that occurred inside City Hall, you first have to understand the city itself. The San Francisco of the 1970s was a city of tectonic plates grinding against one another. It was, on one hand, the city of Haight-Ashbury, of free love, of radical politics and social experimentation. It was a beacon for those fleeing the conformity of mainstream America, and by the mid-70s, it had become the undisputed capital of a new, assertive gay rights movement. Tens of thousands of gay men and lesbians had flocked to the city, seeking refuge and community. They found it in the Castro, transforming the neighborhood into a bustling, joyous, and politically potent enclave. This was the San Francisco of Harvey Milk and George Moscone, a city of inclusion, of progressive ideals, of radical possibility. But there was another San Francisco. It was a city of church steeples and union halls, of tightly knit Irish, Italian, and Polish neighborhoods, where families had lived for generations. It was a city of cops and firefighters, of longshoremen and city workers. They were socially conservative, deeply Catholic, and they saw the Cultural Revolution happening in their own backyard with a mixture of fear and resentment. They felt like strangers in their own home. Their San Francisco was a city of tradition, of family values, of law and order, and their political voice, their great hope to reclaim the city's soul, was Dan White. Daniel James White was, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of this old San Francisco. Born and raised in the city's blue-collar Visitation Valley neighborhood, he was the second of 9 children in a devoutly Irish Catholic family. His father was a fire captain, a hero in the neighborhood. Dan followed a path of service and traditional masculinity. He was a paperboy, a high school athlete. He enlisted in the Army at 18 and served as a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. When he returned home, he joined the San Francisco Police Department, walking a beat in the very neighborhoods where he grew up. He was by all accounts a good cop, tough but fair, but he resigned after 2 years, frustrated by what he saw as a lenient and inefficient system. He then joined the fire department, just like his father. He was a hero, once being praised in the newspaper for rescuing a woman and her baby from a high-rise apartment fire. He was the all-American boy, handsome, clean-cut, a devoted husband to his wife, Mary Ann, and a new father. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't smoke. He was a fitness fanatic, constantly running or playing softball. He was obsessed with nutrition, shunning sugar and junk food. He presented a picture of perfect, rigid self-control. When he decided to run for the Board of Supervisors in 1977, he was seen as a breath of fresh air. He campaigned as a hometown hero, a family man who would fight for the little guy against the radical fringe and the downtown corporate interests. He was everything the new San Francisco wasn't. And he won. His district, District 8, covered many of the city's southern conservative neighborhoods. His victory was a triumph for the old San Francisco. On the very same day, in a district just a few miles but a cultural universe away, Harvey Milk also won. His victory was historic. He wasn't just a supervisor. He was the first openly gay man elected to a major public office in the United States. His journey had been long and arduous. Born in Woodmere, New York, Milk had lived a largely conventional, closeted life for decades. He served in the Navy during the Korean War, worked as a teacher, and even as a financial analyst on Wall Street. He was a Goldwater Republican for a time, but the counterculture of the 1960s changed him. He grew his hair long, embraced his identity, and in 1972, he followed his then-boyfriend to San Francisco, landing in the Castro. He opened a camera shop, Castro Camera, which quickly became the neighborhood's unofficial town hall. Harvey was a force of nature, charismatic, funny, relentless, and a brilliant organizer. He saw that the gay community's growing numbers meant growing political power. If only they could be mobilized. He ran for supervisor 3 times and lost. But with each campaign, his Coalition of the Dispossessed, a powerful alliance of gay people, union workers, racial minorities, and senior citizens, grew stronger. His 1977 victory was a watershed moment. For gay people across the country, it was a signal that they could not only fight back, but they could win. He famously began his speeches, "My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you." It was a call to hope, a demand for visibility. At the head of this new, progressive city government was Mayor George Moscone, a skilled and popular liberal politician. Moscone had built his career championing the underdog. As mayor, he actively worked to make City Hall more inclusive, appointing women, minorities, and gay people to influential commissions and positions. He was a key ally to Harvey Milk. He saw Milk not as a single-issue gay supervisor, but as a talented politician who represented a vital and energized part of the city. The two of them, along with other progressive supervisors, formed a powerful voting bloc that began to reshape San Francisco's laws and priorities. Initially, Dan White and Harvey Milk had a surprisingly decent working relationship. White, despite his conservative base, saw himself as an independent, and he and Milk found common ground on some local issues. Milk even supported White's proposal to build a drug and alcohol treatment center in his district. There was a flicker of a possibility, of a pragmatic alliance, but it wouldn't last. The political fault lines in the city were too deep, the cultural chasm too wide. The two men were on a collision course, and their personalities were oil and water. Milk was theatrical, emotional, and a master of political horse trading. White was rigid, earnest, and deeply moralistic. He took politics personally. He saw compromise as a sign of weakness and political opposition as a personal betrayal. The breaking point was Proposition 6, a statewide ballot initiative sponsored by State Senator John Briggs. It was a viciously homophobic measure that would have banned gay people from teaching in public schools. For Harvey Milk, defeating Briggs was an existential fight. He debated Briggs across the state, becoming the national face of the opposition. The campaign was ugly and deeply personal, filled with hateful rhetoric. In San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors voted to officially oppose Proposition 6. The vote was 10-1. The lone dissenting vote was Dan White. He argued it was a matter of states' rights, but to Milk and the entire gay community, his vote was an unforgivable act of bigotry. Any hope of an alliance was shattered. From that moment on, they were adversaries. White found himself increasingly isolated on the board. He was frustrated by the political maneuvering, the backroom deals, and the constant need to compromise. He felt that the mayor and the progressive supervisors were ignoring the needs of his constituents, the hard-working families he had promised to protect. The financial strain was also immense. He had quit his secure, well-paying job at the fire department to take the supervisor position, which paid only $9,600 a year. a paltry sum even in 1978. He and his wife had a new baby, and they were struggling to make ends meet. He was running a baked potato stand at Pier 39, a venture that was failing miserably. The pressure was mounting. The all-American boy, the hometown hero, was failing. He felt humiliated, powerless, and profoundly depressed. On November 10, 1978, just 2 days after the victorious defeat of Proposition 6, Dan White did something impulsive. He abruptly resigned from the Board of Supervisors. He issued a statement citing the financial hardship and the corrupting influence of politics on his family life. His supporters were stunned and begged him to reconsider. The real estate developers and police union officials who had backed him, who saw him as their last best hope against the city's liberal tide, immediately began lobbying him to take back his resignation, and they promised him financial support. Within days, White was consumed with regret. He had made a terrible mistake. He wanted his job back. He went to Mayor Moscone and asked to be reappointed. Moscone was initially sympathetic, but the city charter was ambiguous about whether a supervisor who resigned could simply be handed his job back. More importantly, Moscone's progressive allies, especially Harvey Milk, saw White's resignation as a golden opportunity. They now had the chance to replace a conservative adversary with a liberal ally, shifting the balance of power on the board decisively in their favor. Milk lobbied the mayor fiercely. He argued that reappointing White would be a betrayal of the gay community and all the other groups who had voted for Moscone. It would be seen as caving to right-wing pressure. The debate raged for nearly 2 weeks. Dan White, waiting for the mayor's decision, grew more and more desperate. He saw this not just as a political decision, but as a test of his honor and his worth as a man. He pleaded with the mayor. He had reporters call on his behalf. The pressure on Moscone was immense. On the weekend before his final decision, Moscone told a reporter that he had decided not to reappoint White. He felt it would be wrong, both politically and legally. The news leaked. When Dan White heard it, he was devastated. But he didn't hear it from the mayor. He heard it from a television reporter who called him for a comment on the evening of Sunday, November 26th. In White's mind, this was the ultimate humiliation. Moscone hadn't even given him the courtesy of a phone call. It was a public slap in the face. All that night he stewed. He couldn't sleep. The rigid self-control that had defined his entire life was cracking. The next morning he asked his wife's assistant to give him a ride. He said he needed to go downtown to City Hall. He wanted to talk to the mayor one last time. Before he left the house, he took his police service revolver from its holster in his closet, and he took the extra bullets. The events of Monday, November 27, 1978, unfolded with the grim, inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. At around 10:25 a.m., Dan White arrived at City Hall. He knew that since a recent spate of threats, all main entrances were now equipped with metal detectors. Carrying a concealed weapon, he would have been stopped. But Dan White knew the building's secrets. He walked to a side entrance on McAllister Street, went down a short flight of stairs, and approached a basement window. He jimmied it open, hoisted himself through, and dropped down into a storage room, unseen. He had bypassed security completely. This single act would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case for premeditation. It was not the act of a man seeking a conversation. It was the act of a man with a plan. He walked up the stairs and into the Grand Rotunda. Brushing off his suit, he was composed, calm. He intercepted his friend, Supervisor Diane Feinstein, and asked if he could speak with the mayor. Feinstein told him Moscone was busy, but she would try to get him in. A few moments later, White was ushered into the opulent mayor's outer office. While he waited, he spoke with Mosconi's appointments secretary, Seer Coppertini. He was polite, even making small talk. When George Mosconi emerged, he greeted White warmly and led him into his private office, just off the main room. He offered White a drink. Mosconi was known for his ability to smooth things over, to find common ground. He likely thought he could calm White down, explain his decision, and part ways on civil terms. The two men were alone. No one knows the exact words that were exchanged, but according to White's later confession, he pleaded with Mosconi one last time to reappoint him. He talked about his family, his service to the city, his financial struggles. He begged. Mosconi was firm. He told White the decision was made. He was going to appoint someone else. The political process was moving on. As Mosconi walked toward the wet bar to pour them a drink, a symbol of a conversation coming to an end, Dan White pulled out his .38 revolver. He shot the mayor in the chest, and then again in the shoulder. Mosconi collapsed to the floor. White then stood over him and fired 2 more shots execution style into the side of the mayor's head. The gunshots were muffled by the thick, ornate walls of the office. Seer Coppertini heard a faint popping sound, but dismissed it as a car backfiring or a champagne cork. Dan White walked out of the mayor's office, unchallenged. He reloaded his gun as he walked, replacing the 4 spent cartridges with 4 of the hollow-point bullets from his pocket. This act of reloading, cool, deliberate, and methodical, would also be a crucial piece of evidence. He strode down the long marbled hallway, past the grand staircase toward the offices of the Board of Supervisors. He was looking for Harvey Milk. He found Milk in his office and called out to him. "Harvey, can I see you for a minute?" He asked Milk to come to his old office just down the hall, to avoid being overheard. Milk, unaware of what had just happened on the other side of the building, agreed. He followed White into the small, empty room. White closed the door. He began to argue with Milk, blaming him for Mosconi's decision. He saw Milk as the serpent who had poisoned the mayor's mind against him. The argument quickly escalated. White pulled out his gun again. He shot Harvey Milk 5 times. He shot him in the chest, through the back, and, as with Mosconi, twice in the head at point-blank range, after Milk had already fallen to the floor. The brutality was shocking. The final 2 shots were fired with the barrel of the gun touching Milk's skull. It was an assassination fueled by a terrifying, personal rage. This time, the gunshots were not muffled. People in the supervisor's offices heard them clearly. Dianne Feinstein, then the president of the Board of Supervisors, heard the pops and smelled gunpowder. Her first thought was that a car had backfired and the fumes had come through the window. But then she saw Dan White stride briskly out of his old office and exit the building. Something was wrong. She walked toward Milk's office, and a legislative aide, his face pale with horror, pointed her to White's old office. Feinstein opened the door and saw Harvey Milk lying face down in a pool of blood. Her training as the daughter of a surgeon kicked in. She knelt down and felt for a pulse in his neck. She found none. But when her finger came away, she saw a hole in his wrist where a bullet had passed clean through. She knew instantly he was dead. At almost the same moment, across the building, Seer Coppertini had grown concerned about the silence from the mayor's office. She peeked inside and saw George Mosconi's body on the floor behind his desk. Chaos erupted. Police swarmed City Hall. The building was sealed. Rumors flew. Had there been a terrorist attack, a coup? For what felt like an eternity, nobody knew what was happening. Then, just after 11:30 a.m., Dianne Feinstein, her hand still trembling and visibly smeared with Harvey Milk's blood, stepped up to a bank of microphones in the City Hall press room. Her voice shaking with shock and grief, she delivered the devastating news. As president of the Board of Supervisors, it is my dreadful duty to inform you that Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed." She paused, then added, "The suspect is Supervisor Dan White." The city went into a state of profound shock. That evening, a crowd of tens of thousands, a sea of flickering candles, flowed silently from the Castro to the steps of City Hall. It was a spontaneous, heartbreaking vigil of grief and disbelief. San Francisco had lost its progressive leader and its most courageous voice for equality in a single brutal act. While the city mourned, Dan White walked into the Northern Police Station, a station where he had once worked. He turned himself in to his old friends on the force. He was taken to an interrogation room, where he gave a rambling, tearful confession to Inspector Frank Falzon. He admitted to everything. He spoke of the pressure, the humiliation, the feeling that his life was falling apart. He claimed he had no intention of killing anyone when he went to City Hall, that he just snapped. The confession was recorded. With a suspect in custody and a full confession on tape, the case against Dan White seemed open and shut. It was a clear-cut case of first-degree murder, twice over. No one could have predicted the legal storm that was about to break. The trial of Dan White began in May of 1979, and from the outset it was clear that the defense was not going to dispute the facts of what happened. They couldn't. White had confessed. He had killed 2 people in cold blood. Instead, defense attorney Douglas Schmidt would focus entirely on Dan White's state of mind. The strategy was audacious. To argue that Dan White, due to a severe mental breakdown, was incapable of the premeditation and malice aforethought required for a murder conviction. They were going to argue for diminished capacity. This legal concept is crucial to understanding the entire case. The diminished capacity defense, which existed in California law at the time, was not an insanity plea. An insanity defense argues that a defendant is not guilty because they were unable to distinguish right from wrong. Diminished capacity was far more nuanced. It argued that while the defendant might have known what they were doing was wrong, they lacked the mental capacity to form the specific intent to commit the crime. For first-degree murder, the prosecution had to prove not only that the defendant killed someone, but that they did so with premeditation. That is, they thought about it and planned it beforehand, and with malice aforethought, a conscious and deliberate intention to kill. The defense's goal was to introduce evidence of a mental defect or illness that would negate these elements, forcing the jury to convict on a lesser charge, like second-degree murder, or, ideally for the defense, voluntary manslaughter. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Thomas Norman, felt they had an ironclad case for first-degree murder. They laid out the evidence of premeditation piece by piece. Dan White didn't just happen to have his gun on him. He went home to get it. He didn't just carry the gun. He brought 10 extra hollow-point bullets, ammunition specifically designed for maximum damage. He didn't walk through the front door. He deliberately climbed through a basement window to avoid the metal detectors. He didn't just shoot his victims. He shot them, paused, and then shot them again in the head, execution style. And in between the 2 killings, he calmly and deliberately reloaded his weapon. This, the prosecution argued, was the very definition of a cold, calculated, premeditated assassination. His taped confession, in which he coherently laid out his motives and actions, would surely seal his fate. The prosecution was so confident, they didn't even play the most emotional parts of the confession for the jury, fearing it might engender sympathy for White. It would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The defense's case, by contrast, was a deep dive into the psyche of Dan White. They presented him not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a deeply troubled man who had completely unraveled under immense pressure. They painted a picture of a good man, a hometown hero, a dedicated public servant, driven to the breaking point. They called a parade of character witnesses, friends, family, former colleagues, who all testified that the Dan White who committed these murders was not the Dan White they knew. They described him as increasingly morose, withdrawn, and paranoid in the weeks leading up to the killings. The centerpiece of their strategy was the testimony of a psychiatrist named Martin Blinder. Blinder testified that Dan White was suffering from a severe bout of clinical depression. He argued that this depression had eroded White's ability to think rationally. His judgment was impaired. His emotions were out of control. Blinder claimed that on the morning of the murders, White was functioning as a human automaton, acting without any real conscious thought or planning. He was a man on emotional autopilot, his actions driven by a storm of irrational feelings rather than a calculated plan. And this is where the junk food entered the story. As evidence of White's deep depression, Blinder pointed to a series of significant behavioral changes. The most notable of these was White's diet. The defense established that Dan White was a health fanatic, a man who prided himself on his physical fitness and clean living. But in the weeks before the murders, he had abandoned his healthy habits. He had quit running. He was moody and lethargic, and he had started consuming vast quantities of sugary junk food, Twinkies, Coca-Cola, donuts. The defense presented this not as the cause of his actions, but as a dramatic symptom of his underlying mental illness. The argument was subtle but powerful. For a man defined by his rigid self-control, this descent into binging on sugar was presented as proof that his capacity for self-regulation had collapsed. It was anecdotal evidence of his anhedonia, his inability to feel pleasure, a classic sign of depression. He was seeking a quick, artificial sugar high to medicate his despair because nothing else brought him joy anymore. The junk food was a single, vivid detail in a much larger portrait of a man coming apart at the seams. It was designed to make his mental state tangible and relatable to the jury. The prosecution, tragically, failed to effectively challenge this narrative. They didn't call their own psychiatric experts to rebut Blinder's testimony. They largely dismissed the defense as psychological mumbo-jumbo. They believed the facts of the crime were so stark, so brutal, that no amount of psychiatric testimony could excuse them. They simply couldn't imagine that a jury would buy it. Further compounding the prosecution's problems was the jury itself. The defense team, through careful use of their peremptory challenges, had managed to assemble a jury that was, in many ways, a jury of Dan White's peers. It was overwhelmingly white, largely Catholic, and composed of working-class people from neighborhoods very similar to White's own. It was a jury of the old San Francisco. Crucially, the jury pool had been vetted for any prejudice against homosexuals, and anyone who expressed strong pro-gay rights sentiments was excused. The result was a jury that was perhaps predisposed to see Dan White not as a monster, but as a man like them, a man who had been pushed too far by the strange and threatening new forces taking over their city. Finally, the defense played the entire unedited tape of White's confession. The prosecution had held back the most emotional parts, but the defense played it all. The jury heard Dan White break down, weeping uncontrollably, as he described his downfall. He sounded confused, remorseful, and overwhelmed. It was a powerful performance, and it directly contradicted the prosecution's image of him as a cool and calculating killer. It made him seem human, broken, and even sympathetic. As the trial concluded, the city held its breath. For the gay community and its allies, anything less than a first-degree murder conviction would be an unthinkable injustice. It would send a message that you could kill a gay leader in broad daylight and get away with it. They waited for the verdict, praying that the jury would see the crime for what it was, a politically motivated assassination. But the media had already begun to spin its own version of the story. Reporters covering the trial, looking for a simple, catchy angle to explain a complex psychiatric defense, latched onto the most unusual detail: the Twinkies. The nuanced argument about depression and its symptoms was flattened. Satirical columnist Herb Caen and journalist Paul Avery began using a catchy, dismissive phrase to describe the strategy: the Twinkie Defense. The name stuck. It spread like wildfire. Soon, the entire country was talking about the killer in San Francisco who claimed a sugar rush from junk food made him do it. It was a brilliant, cynical, and completely inaccurate caricature, but it created a powerful public perception that the defense was a ridiculous sham, an absurd excuse for a heinous crime. This perception would play a huge role in the firestorm to come. On May 21, 1979, the jury returned its verdict. The foreman announced that they had found Dan White not guilty of first-degree murder. They had found him not guilty of second-degree murder. They had found him guilty on 2 counts of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. There was a gasp in the courtroom, then stunned silence, then tears. Voluntary manslaughter. The legal definition in California at the time was an unlawful killing done in the heat of passion, or with a diminished capacity. It implied that Dan White had been provoked, or that he was so mentally impaired that he didn't possess malice. The jury had bought the defense's argument, hook, line, and sinker. The sentence handed down by the judge was even more shocking. For the assassination of 2 public officials, Dan White was sentenced to a maximum of 7 years and 8 months in prison. With good behavior, he would be eligible for parole in just over 5 years. 5 years. To the thousands of people gathered outside City Hall, and especially to the gay community, the verdict was not just an injustice, it was a declaration of war. It was a slap in the face. It was the system telling them that Harvey Milk's life, their lives, mattered less. It confirmed their deepest fears, that they were not safe, that the law would not protect them, that a homophobic killer could literally get away with murder. As news of the verdict spread through the Castro, grief curdled into pure incandescent rage. An impromptu march began, starting on Castro Street and heading toward City Hall, the scene of the crime, and now the symbol of this profound betrayal. The crowd swelled from hundreds to thousands. The early chants of "We want justice" soon gave way to angrier cries, "Avenge Harvey Milk" and "Kill Dan White." By the time the massive crowd reached City Hall, the mood was explosive. What followed became known as the White Night Riots. The protest devolved into a chaotic and violent confrontation. People in the crowd began throwing rocks and bottles at the building, smashing the ornate glass of the front doors. They tore gilded ornamental work from the iron gates and used it as battering rams. A squadron of police officers formed a line to protect the building, and the crowd clashed with them directly. Newsstands were set on fire. Then the ultimate act of defiance. A dozen police cars parked in front of City Hall were set ablaze, their burning hulks sending thick black smoke into the night sky, a funeral pyre for a city's broken heart. The police were overwhelmed. They retreated, and for a time the rioters controlled the plaza. But later that night, the police decided to retaliate. Instead of attempting to disperse the crowd at City Hall, a contingent of officers in full riot gear drove their cruisers directly to the Castro district. They parked their cars, covered their badge numbers with black tape, and stormed into the neighborhood. They targeted the Elephant Walk, a popular gay bar on Castro Street. They smashed its large plate glass windows and charged inside, billy clubs swinging. They indiscriminately beat patrons, staff, anyone who was in their way. It was a calculated act of collective punishment, an assault not just on rioters, but on the entire gay community. The violence went on for hours. By the end of the night, more than 160 people, both protesters and police, had been hospitalized. The city was scarred, and the already fraught relationship between the SFPD and the gay community was shattered. The aftermath of the verdict and the riots was long and painful. Dan White was sent to Soledad State Prison. He served just over 5 years of his sentence and was paroled in January 1984. His release was met with outrage and fear. He was secretly moved to Los Angeles, as San Francisco was deemed too dangerous for him. He was a pariah, a man stripped of his identity and his home. A year later, in October 1985, after returning to San Francisco to live with his wife and children, he attached a garden hose to the exhaust pipe of his car, ran it into the vehicle, and took his own life. He died of carbon monoxide poisoning, alone in his garage. The hometown hero, the all-American boy, ended his life in quiet disgrace. The legal legacy of the case was swift and decisive. The public outrage over the Twinkie defense, that powerful, misleading myth, was so immense that it fueled a political backlash against the very concept of diminished capacity. In 1982, California voters overwhelmingly passed Proposition 8, the Victims' Bill of Rights, a sweeping criminal justice reform initiative. One of its key provisions was the complete abolition of the diminished capacity defense. Lawmakers and the public felt it had become a loophole for guilty criminals to escape justice. The verdict in the Dan White trial was the single most important catalyst for that change. The anatomy of this case is, therefore, not the anatomy of a crime alone. It is the anatomy of a defense and the anatomy of a myth. The strategy of diminished capacity was a legally valid, if controversial, tool available to Dan White's lawyers. They used it brilliantly, crafting a narrative of a broken man that resonated with a sympathetic jury. But that nuanced legal argument was then refracted through the prism of the media and transformed into the Twinkie defense, an absurd and insulting caricature that ironically did more to shape the public's understanding of the case than the actual trial ever did. The myth became more powerful than the reality. It's a myth that obscures the deeper truths of the tragedy. It obscures the raw political hatred and homophobic bigotry that fueled the crime. It obscures the profound systemic failures of a legal system that allowed a jury, seemingly blind to the evidence of premeditation, to deliver a verdict that felt like a validation of violence. And it obscures the courage of a community that, in the face of devastating loss and institutional betrayal, refused to be silenced. The flames that consumed police cars on that violent May night in 1979 were born from a deep and righteous rage, but they also illuminated a path forward. The White Night riots, for all their chaos, galvanized the gay rights movement, transforming grief into political power and ensuring that the legacy of Harvey Milk would not be one of victimhood, but of an unending fight for justice. The Twinkie defense may be what history remembers with a cynical laugh, but it was the city of San Francisco that was left to cry. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.